Okay, let's get right back into this. Balanced budget multiplier. Let me tell you, first of all, it had been a long time since I had taught intermediate macro. The last time I taught this again, and I don't remember what the year was, but maybe 5-6 years ago was the first time I taught it in a long time. And I decided that I didn't like the way I used to teach it. That if I had taken my own intermediate macro class, it was okay. So I changed a bunch of stuff around to make it more interesting. More interesting to me, at any rate, thinking of me as a student. And when I first put it together, I ended up talking about, after I just finished this multiplier thing, talking like about 3 other concepts with the multiplier. It wasn't worth the time. Teaching is, when you're trying to figure out what to put in a class, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Is the amount of time I'm going to spend on that worth how much they learn from that? And I decided, I had one with a import and a taxation factor that would alter the multiplier, and it just wasn't worth the time. But this one is. Right, so there's only one thing left out of what I used to do the first time I started reteaching this class, and that is the balanced budget multiplier. And the idea here, and I'll tell you, one of the reasons why I like to go over this is because when I first learned it, I was like, oh yeah, I never would have thought about that. So it really kind of stuck with me, so I thought you might find it interesting. And also it actually highlights some things in terms of policy and in terms of how the multiplier works that you might not otherwise see. This is also covered in the handout on the multiplier. So here we go. This is going to be, here's the story. What if the government were to go from, I'm an idiot. Hang on. What if the government were to go from not spending any money at all to, or taxing any money. Oh, I wrote the same thing twice. To taxing and spending $10. What impact would there be on GDP? Now your first inclination is, well, it'd leave it exactly the same. If the government took out $10 and then spent $10, it would leave it exactly the same. No, it doesn't. This is interesting, all right? So, once again, if the government went from not spending or taxing at all to spending and taxing $10, or we could say spending and taxing equal to 10 and down here to 20 or whatever, the zero is just to make it easy to start with. It doesn't have to start at 0. But it turns out that even a balanced budget stimulates the macroeconomy. Check this out. So with this multiplier, we're going to have to specify consumption a little bit differently. First equation, y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. Our old friend, GDP. C plus I plus g plus x minus m. And then consumption is equal to A plus B times YD. Not Y, but YD. Where YD is total income minus taxes. It's disposable income. Disposable income. Let me write that down here. Disposable income. That's the amount of income you have left after taxes. So consumption really can't take place from taxes, obviously, from money that was taxed away. It can only take place with money you have left over. So what I'm going to do now is, again, here in disposable income is just income minus taxes. By the way, you can do this same calculation with a tax rate instead of a lump sum tax. It is much more complicated for the same answer. Close enough. Once again, all right, so I'm going to do a lump sum tax. The taxation of the United States is not going to be dependent in this example on how much income there is. That's not true. In real life, it is very dependent on how much income there is. Again, this will give us the same answer, but much more quickly. All right, so all I got to do now is I'm going to have to re-derive the multiplier. So here we go. Let's see. Y is equal to A plus B YD plus I plus G plus x minus m. Okay, so notice first, I have substituted in here what came from this equation up here. Instead of c, I now have a plus b times yd. And guess what I do next? Y equals a plus b times y minus t plus I plus g plus x minus m. So what I did next, let's see, I'll use a different color. I shall use horned frog purple. All right. Next, I got that I substituted y minus t in for yd. All right, so ultimately, we substituted this in for that, and then this in for that. All right, so here's our new equation right here. And I think I'm going to need to erase all this and just write this at the top and go from there to do the derivation. All right. Y is equal to a plus b times y minus t plus I plus g plus x minus m. Okay, is that right, John? A plus b, yeah, that's right, okay. All right, now we just derived the multiplier. So let's see, first we multiply through this expression right here. Y is equal to a plus by minus bt plus I plus g plus x minus m. Get all the y's on the left-hand side. Y minus by is equal to a plus, a minus bt plus I plus g plus x minus m. Factor y out. Equals a minus bt plus I plus g plus x minus m. And then divide both sides by 1 minus b, or in other words, multiply both sides by 1 over 1 minus b. Y equals 1 over 1 minus b. A minus bt plus I plus g plus x minus m. Now notice we got the same multiplier. We've got the same multiplier. If we did the tax rate as opposed to the lump sum tax, we wouldn't get the same multiplier. We've got the same multiplier, but we have a different equation over here on the right. And notice that b enters in once again, unlike the previous example, in negatively. Here when it's multiplied by t, actually the t, that's the negative part, of course, multiplied by b. Now, let me write this equation at the top, and then I'm going to give you an example to show you what I was saying earlier, and that was that even a balanced budget will increase GDP. And then I'll tell you why, because it's really interesting. Well, it was interesting to John Harvey when he took this class in 1980. All right. See if I remember the equation. Y is equal to 1 over 1 minus b, a minus bt plus I plus g plus x minus m. All right, here's our equation. And let's make up some numbers here, because this is going to be the easiest way to make this point. Let's say, what is it, buddy? Let's say that b is equal to 0.8. Let's not use the same b all the time. And then I'm going to make it really, really simple here. A is equal to, g is equal to, t is equal to, x is equal to m is equal to 0. So we're going to just set all those to 0 just to make it nice and simple. And I is equal to, I don't know, 50. All right. So a little bit of glare on that, sorry. But I is equal to 50. All right, so let's plug that in. Y is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.8 times 50, all right? Because everything else is 0, times 50. What's that? Let's see, that's 5, so it's 250. 250. That would be GDP. If government spending, taxation, exports, imports, and A were 0, investment was 50, then every other term up there drops out except for the I. We're just by assumption saying that the propensity to consume is 0.8, marginal propensity to consume. And so that's a 5. 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is the same thing as 1 over 0.2, which is 5. 5 times 50 is 250. All right. Now let's say that all of a sudden, that dang government, let's see, I think I'll use black. All right. The government decides that they're going to tax and spend $10 or 10 trillion, whatever we're talking about here, $10. All right, let's plug it all back in again and see what we get. Y is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.8. Now, negative 0.8 times 10 plus 10 plus 10. Let me write over top of that what those were. This was that was B, of course, that's T, that's I, and that's G, all right? So before we just had the 10, now we've got the negative 0.8 times 10, and we've got that other 10 for government spending. So let's see what that works out to. Let's see, that's going to be, I think I'll do it over here. That's going to be 5 times, and we've got 20 minus 8, so we've got 8. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I forgot what, I wondered why I was getting such a different number. I forgot I had done investment as 50. Those of you in the home version of this are probably thinking, no, you wrote down the wrong thing. All right, here we go. 50. All right, so we have 60 minus 8, so we've got 52. There, that makes sense. Which means GDP is 260, all right? So taxing is 10, government spending is 10, and we still left investment as 50. And so that's 60 minus 8 is 52. 5 times 52 is 260. Why did GDP go up? Why did GDP go up? Now, I'll let you think about it for a second. Because it actually turns out to be really simple. That $10 that the government taxed away from people, how much of that would they have spent? They would have spent $8, right? They would have spent $8. But how much of that $10 that they taxed away, how much of it did the government spend? Well, they spent all 10 of it. They didn't just spend 80% of it, they spent all of it. When they took that money out of the paycheck, when they took that $10 out, you would have gone and spent $8 of that and thereby created more income. But the government is going to spend all of it. So they're going to spend $2 more than you would have. And what's 2 times 5? It's 10. And notice the difference. Notice the difference here is 10. Total GDP went up by $10, right? Why? Because the $2 that you would have saved, the government spent. And when they spent it, it kicked into a force. Of course, the multiplier kicked in, right? So that $2 became $10, right? So the reason why the balanced budget multiplier actually ends up with a higher level of GDP is because the government spends every penny of an amount of income that you would have saved. That was poorly worded. The government spends all of something that you would have only spent part of. You would have only spent 80%, they're spending it all, right? So that's balanced budget multiplier. What was that? 14 minutes and 30 seconds. And I think that's good for this one. I wonder how close it is to lunch now. I know you'll be relieved to hear that I've now had lunch and feel much better. Here comes the dog. He wants to be picked up again. Not happening, brother. I have to do Keynes Z-D Diagram. You know what that means, don't you? It's going to be way too complicated for you to be up here. Look, it's be like a horror movie. Whoop, 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 whoop. Okay. I'm going to adjust the camera a little bit here. I'd like to get a little closer to the screen over there, the whiteboard. Okay, maybe that'll work. All right. Here's the next subject of lecture. And let me double check here and make sure I didn't skip something. No. I'll tell you about that later. Okay, oh yeah. Then there's all that stuff there. No, we're going to get to the bottom. All right. Let's see, what have I told you so far? The injections are really important. I, G, and X, although it's going to turn out that I is the biggest one of all. I'm going to turn this up just a little bit more. Investment is going to be the most important one of all. And in order to put this into a context, okay, what are we ultimately worried about? What are we ultimately concerned with, right? Well, in this school of thought, it's going to be employment, right? That's the bottom line. We have sufficient goods and services to feed, clothe, shelter everybody in the country, right? There's no question about it. And much more than that. The problem is that there aren't enough jobs. And the post-Keynesian view is that is the key problem, right? Not only is that just sort of unjust that you can have people who are willing to work and for whom we can produce sufficient output, but it also causes all kinds of other problems, unemployment does. As you'll see at the very end of the semester, one of the last readings is about all the social problems it causes. So that's the big goal, is to eliminate involuntary unemployment. Now, and of course, Keynes is writing during the Great Depression, right? So there's a lot of that going on. The common way of looking at unemployment at that point, well, and honestly, in a lot of schools of thought still today, is to look at the market for labor, all right? The wage rate, which is the price of labor, and N, which is used for employment. It's the number of workers or the number of hours worked in the economy, or whatever you want to do. Some people use an L there, I use an N. Here is the supply of labor. The idea being that everything else being equal, the higher the wage rate, the larger the number of people who are willing to work. And here is the demand for labor. There, the idea being that the higher the wage rate, the fewer people firms can afford to hire. And by the way, if we're going to do this properly, this is derived from, the profit maximizing condition for the firm, right? So the labor demand curve is the same thing as the marginal productive labor curve, which is all the profit maximizing points for the firm. So these are all the points that would maximize profits for firms. If this is the current wage rate, then this number of workers would maximize their profits. If this is the current wage rate, then this number of workers would maximize their profits. So the firm wants to be on that curve, right? If the firm is short of that curve, they are foregoing profit opportunities. Because we could have hired more people and sold more stuff. If they're beyond it, then they are incurring losses. They're like, well, we shouldn't have produced that much. Nobody wants that stuff. So they want to be on the line. Likewise, with the supply curve, that's going to be exactly where, given people's desire for leisure versus labor, this is where they're going to be satisfied when they're on the curve. Now, of course, you know the story now, that in equilibrium, we end up right there where everyone who wants a job has a job, right? And if we're not there, for example, if we have the Great Depression, well, I'm not going to label that. I'm just going to mark it up here. Invol-un-emp is that gap. Involuntary unemployment. The current wage rate is W sub 1, which means that firms, I guess I will label this, firms feel like they'll maximize profits at N sub 1, so that's how many people they hire. But at W sub 1, N sub 2 people would like to work, all right? I'm going to zoom it into a little bit, let's see here, a little bit more, sorry. There's going to be a lot of graphs here, and I want to make sure. Get everything in there. All right, let's see. So that many people would like to work. So that's involuntary unemployment. But now, if this is your approach to how the labor market works, your logical conclusion is going to be, aha, then don't worry, because this is an excess supply of labor. Workers will compete among themselves for jobs, drive down the wage rate until we're at the intersection. Unemployment will go away automatically. Remember I said earlier that this neoclassical approach assumes that the economy fixes itself, all right? That it automatically corrects. Something like this. There are other factors as well, but something like this. Now, a couple of things. First of all, the Great Depression went on for a long time, all right? And if I'm trying to decide which thing to do next. If this was going to happen, surely it would have happened when there was 25% unemployment. So Keynes is trying to figure, Keynes, who was brought up this, well, actually, Keynes doesn't have an econ degree, he has a math degree, but his father was a very famous economist and who taught at Cambridge, so he knew a lot of economists. But anyway, Keynes has been taught this approach, and he's like, well, what the heck's going on? Because we've got lots of unemployment. You'd think the bigger this gap was, the greater the competition would be, the more it would drive the wage rate down. He says something else must be going on. Now he says in chapter 2 of the general theory, he says, well, there are things that can inhibit the downward adjustment of the wage rate. Check this out. There are things that can inhibit the adjustment of the wage rate. All right, so we're up there with involuntary unemployment. We call this W sub 0, W, N sub 1 and N sub 2. N sub 1 and N sub 2. All right, so we've got this many people involuntarily unemployed. There's always people unemployed for voluntary reasons. We're only worried about the involuntary ones right here. Well, there could be a minimum wage law. Or there could be the trade unions are blocking the adjustment of wages, and so on. He talks about this in chapter 2, right? Remember I told you earlier that the neoclassicals thought, oh, it automatically corrects itself. Oh, that's what you're saying, Keynes. There's something blocking the adjustment process. It does work like this, but something's blocking the adjustment process, all right? And where did they get that? From that chapter 2. Except if you keep on reading, what he says next is, but that can't possibly be it during the Great Depression. There is no time that labor is weaker than a time when we've got really high levels of unemployment. He said, what is it he says? That labor is not more obstinate during the recession, quite the opposite. So he actually dismisses this as a possibility. And yet, that's what the neoclassical Keynesians picked up on, because as I suggested before in the previous video, you tend to notice things that are familiar to you when you read. And so what they noticed was, he's saying it works if only this other stuff didn't get in the way. And Keynes actually mentioned that only to dismiss it. And then went on to say, okay, here's what's really going on. Okay, so here's what's really going on. He says, the real problem here is that while this is a series of equilibrium points, we must be on that curve, all right? If the firms are not on that curve, they will act to fix it. If the firms are to the left, as I suggested just a moment ago, they'll go ahead and hire some more people to maximize their profits. If they're to the right, they'll lay people off, all right? That's a series of equilibrium points. We will be on that curve, all right? This is a series of reference points. That's where workers would like to be, but they really have no way of enforcing their will, all right? So check this out. Let's see. Let's say we're below the intersection, all right? Let me draw a point down here. Sorry. Allergies are starting up here again. Stupid juniper trees are doing something. W sub 1, N sub 3, N sub 4, all right? Firms want N sub 4 workers at W sub 1. only N sub 3 workers showed up for an interview. The firms are saying, crap. We would have liked to have hired a lot more than that. We believe the profit opportunities would induce us to hire all the way to N sub 4. So what does the firm do? They offer to pay higher wages. The firm is totally and completely in charge of that process. Firms offer higher wages. And indeed, they offer higher wages until everyone who wants a job has a job, which means we're on this reference curve. And they are profit maximizing, which means we're on this set of equilibrium curves. But above the intersection, so if it's the firms that are dissatisfied, they have a mechanism that is available to them to make sure that they end up in a position where they are satisfied. If they don't have as many workers as they want, they raise wages. If, on the other hand, and if they have more workers than they want, then they lower wages. On the other hand, now, and of course, the workers down here were perfectly happy. They only, at W sub 1, they only wanted N sub 3 jobs. Well, that's what they got. They were happy. But the firms weren't happy. So the firms acted to correct their happiness, and they could do so. Above the intersection, the firms are happy. The firms want, at W sub 0, N sub 1 workers. How many workers have they got? N sub 1, all right? In fact, they had a waiting room full of N sub 2 people. They picked out N sub 1 of them, all right? So the firms have got what they want at W sub 0. Do the workers? No. Do they want to work, offer to work for less? Some of them certainly do. But firms aren't hiring. Firms have got everybody they want. Firms already have everybody they want at N sub 1. They're not hiring. Do you not think that in the United States of America, when unemployment was 25%, that people weren't driving from community to community looking for work? They absolutely were. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no welfare. They were going everywhere. If you see the movie Grapes of Wrath, it's a bunch of people from Oklahoma driving to California because they heard there's a job out there. All right, so I can't remember what, several places they go through. There's not jobs and so forth. But you know, if the firm's not hiring, I don't care that you want to work for less. It's irrelevant. And so Keynes is saying that the problem is that the only equilibrium points on this graph, let's see, I'll use horned frog purple, are here up to here. Remember, if we're below the intersection, we won't stay there. Right? Now, I described all of these as equilibrium points. Well, that's true, but we're not on those points when we're below the intersection. So the firms will always bid up to here. But then above that, we can be on any one of those purple points. We can be on any one of those because workers have no means of enforcing their will. They don't actually have a situation of competing with each other to drive wages down. Sure, if somebody retires, we replace you with a cheaper worker. If somebody gets fired, we replace you with a cheaper worker, and so on. But Keynes is saying, but our experience indicates, I mean, yes, we could build an argument. Yes, I mean, this goes back to validity versus cogency. Could we build a valid argument that says that if we're above the intersection, workers compete amongst themselves and drive wages down? Sure. Is it a cogent argument? Are those premises warranted? Apparently not, is what he is saying. That if we have 10 years of unemployment of 10% and higher, and it doesn't go away, there must be something wrong with the argument that says it goes away automatically. One of our premises must not be warranted. And the thing that's not warranted is the idea that workers can actually offer to work for less when firms aren't hiring anybody. All right? That, pardon me, that this graph is not a very useful graph at all. Keynes says, you know, look, we can be on any one of these purple points, right? Well, that's not what we do in econ. We want to know what point we're on, right? At least in the theoretical world, we want to know what point are we on. He said this graph shows us a series of points where we could be. He said, but the problem is this. This was never the issue to start with. Unemployment is not about wages. He says that we see wide fluctuations in employment with practically no change in wages whatsoever. If I had, maybe I'll try to fire this sucker up while I'm talking, because I've got a couple of good graphs in here. But when you see over the course of the business cycle, during expansions, guess what? Unemployment goes way down. During recessions, unemployment goes way up. I mean, it's just absolutely, you don't need to have taken econometrics to see the pattern, right? So he says, wages aren't causing the fluctuations in employment. We are not only finding ourselves with a graph here that's not very useful because it suggests that we actually have a series of equilibrium points and not one, but on top of that, that's not the driving factor. Wages aren't the driving factor. Think of it this way. Let's see here, quantity demanded, and I've got my computer working now, so let me get this something here for you. There's a function of price, price of substitutes, price of complements, income. All right, the quantity of a good or service demanded is a function of a variety of factors, of independent variables. The price of the good or service, the price of substitutes, the price of complements, people's income, right? This is a micro example right now. But when we draw our two-dimensional graph, we've got room for this, which we have to put on there because it's what we're trying to explain, and one of the other variables. And so which one of the others are we going to want to put on there? Presumably the one that tends to cause the greatest amount of fluctuation in the dependent variable. It's not wages. It's not fluctuations in wages. So, you know, we put one variable on there, which in a micro class we put price on there, right? And then everything else has to shift it. So what we've done in the labor market traditionally is we put the variable we want to explain right here. Oh, and I'll bet this is the most important variable. Keynes is saying, no, it's not. And I do have this fired up, and let me show you this from my perspectives in macro class, which I haven't had a chance to teach for a while, but I really enjoy because it is explaining business cycles. Maybe not next year. I already know what I'm teaching next year, but maybe the year after that. Let's see here. Recessions. I want this big. Unfortunately, I don't have it organized by I just haven't, I have to find it in here somewhere. I wonder if that's it. Koleski, maybe look into recessions. Anyway, it's a graph of, there it is. Who's the man? Me. There it is. Okay. Control H, let me slide up here. There you go. This is a, oh crap, that's GDP. Dang it! I wanted employment. Where do I have that? Oh, John. What about this one? No. All right, sorry. I'll look for it later. But anyway, point being that when you look at employment versus GDP, oh my God, it's not hard to figure out that what's happening is that when GDP rises, unemployment falls. When GDP falls, unemployment rises. So Keynes says, we got the wrong variable. What we need up there is essentially Y for GDP. So that's what we're about to do. None of this is really directly relevant to our class. I just wanted to show you where he was coming from and why this was a different perspective, and why also why Keynes and Keynesian aren't the same thing, because the Keynesians are still using this graph. Keynes is rejecting the graph, not as being invalid, but not being cogent. That it's not describing what's really going on in the real world because it is making assumptions that don't hold, that are significantly different from reality, so much so that it changes the conclusion. So let's do this instead. Employment and PY. PY is the same thing as Y, by the way. P times Y is the price level times real GDP, and therefore multiplied together it's nominal GDP. And the reason that, and this isn't absolutely standard, but a lot of times economists will use, oh, I found it. A lot of times economists will use uppercase for nominal and lowercase, that lowercase y right there, for real. So what we were using before is y. One could interpret as the nominal value. It's not going to make any difference to us, whether it's nominal or real here, but I do want to make a point about this. But here, I found the graph. That is unemployment since 1954. The shaded areas, the pink areas, are recessions. The white areas are expansions. And you can see there's some lags involved. Notice that unemployment tends to go up even before the recession starts, and then it tends to continue after the recession's over. But otherwise, what we see here is a very clear trend of unemployment way up during recessions and down during expansions. So that's what Keynes's point was. He says, look, we got the wrong variable on the vertical axis, and that's why we're misunderstanding the whole thing. What we need is GDP. So I'm going to tell you why he wants it to be nominal in just a second. And let's first do, what do firms want? Well, let's just say this. When we're thinking of firms on this graph, you think of the vertical axis as expected sales. He says what really causes the big fluctuation in employment is when firms expect to sell a different amount. It's not when they have different wages. Wages don't change that much. Of course, when wages are higher, they want to hire fewer people. But wages don't fluctuate very much. Sales do. All right, sales can fluctuate quite significantly. And so he says expected sales drive the biggest changes in firms' hiring behavior. When expected sales go up, guess what? They want to hire more workers. And it looks like this. I'll tell you why it gets steeper in just a minute. And I don't know why he called it a Z curve, but he did. Maybe they might kind of make it look like an S for the supply of, I don't know. I don't know why he made it a Z. But by the way, if this were that other class I was talking about where we do business cycles, what we do is we take that, guess what? That ND curve over there, that, sorry about the glare, but I think you see the ND curve part. Oh, let me turn this light back on. I had this on earlier that was trying to help some with the glare by creating a different glare. That ND curve over there, that labor demand curve on that original graph, that didn't help at all. Same mathematical equation as the Z curve. If this were that other class, we would take the equation for that, manipulate a couple of things, end up with this curve. So they're the exact same equation. They're the exact same relationship. These are the firm's profit maximizing points. If the firm expects to sell this much, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say the firm because this is macro, not micro. If firms expect to sell this much, then they believe that that is the profit maximizing level of employment. If they expect to sell this much, then that's the profit maximizing level of employment. Now, Keynes did this in nominal terms, not real terms. And why? In the end, it doesn't make much difference, but I think it's important to think about what his thought process, and that was this. Firms live in a nominal world, he said. Firms don't live in a real world. They live in a nominal world. They owe their workers in nominal terms. They owe their suppliers in nominal terms. They make contracts in nominal terms. Their accountants do not go through and divide everything by the consumer price index to figure out what their actual profits were. No, their actual profits are in dollar numbers, all right? They are in nominal figures. And he says, yeah, if we're talking about the economy over the course of 20 years, we'd want to take into account price changes. But in the short run, if I'm the firm, and the short run is where the real world exists, according to Keynes, he really looked down on economic analyses that said, well, but in the long run, it's like, hey, you're just glossing over because you don't understand how to explain the short run. And the long run is simply an accumulation of short runs. So, he says, yes, in a long period, the price level matters, but in the short run, if I'm the firm, I don't give a crap whether I sold more or I sold the same amount for a higher price. Either one is good by me, all right? Because I'm making more money because I'm worried about the dollar value of my sales. So that's why he does it in dollar value over there. All right, so there's the firm's behavior. Oh, I was going to tell you why it got steeper. I'm sorry. Man, I love this stuff. All right. NPY. All right. Notice that the more people there are working, the harder it is for the firms to reconcile hiring one more worker. Let me show what I mean. Let's see. Let's have an increase in workers from 0 to N1 right here, about an eraser length. I'm going to do the same eraser length over here. Okay, that's intended to be the same horizontal distance there. N2, N3. All right, check this out. It takes only a tiny increase in sales from 0 to PY sub 0 to convince firms to hire N sub 1 workers. But to go from 0 to N sub 1. But to have that same increase as 0 to N sub 1 over here, it requires a huge increase in sales. Why? Diminishing marginal productivity of labor. He is sticking to the traditional story as much as he can and saying, look, let's assume we're giving everyone the same wage for simplicity. The more people that are working, then the less productive the additional workers are who are being added to fixed capital, right? Being added to fixed capital. So these workers simply aren't as productive. Not their fault. It's the fact that, you know, we've already got 10 people working on the line at the factory, and 11th person really doesn't add that much, all right? Now, when I went from 0 to 1 person, that was a big deal. We went from not being able to sell anything to being able to sell something. But from 10 to 11 people, there better be an awfully good reason to hire one more person, because that's going to cost us the same as that first person did. But 10 people are not going to be accomplishing that much different than 11 people, and they're starting to get in each other's way now, right? The productivity of the additional workers at the end is lower than the ones at the start. So it gets steeper for that reason, which sucks, because it means it becomes increasingly difficult to squeeze one more percentage point out of unemployment as we go to the right. Indeed, something I haven't shown here yet is, where is the point of full employment? And the point of full employment is not going to be the result of an intersection of a graph. It's going to be the result of demographics, really. Most people don't have much choice about working. We draw this labor supply curve before like people actually had a choice. The vast majority of people don't. In fact, for some people, if their job ended up paying less, they'd take on another job. It's not like they end up, deciding, well, I guess I just won't work after all. There is a social safety net, but honestly, people would rather work. So, as a consequence, if we take the percent, if we take what's it called? Labor participation rate, the labor participation rate, and figure out how many people are 16 years of older, then we pretty much know how many people want to work. So that's demographic. This is how many we're going to end up actually working. The want to work could potentially be N sub F to the right of where Z goes vertical. There's no reason to believe that the private sector actually has a job for everybody who's willing to work. But we'll get to that in a minute. Great stuff, great stuff. All right, now, so there's the, whoa, I just knocked over a nutcracker. This joker right here. There's the connection between what firms expect to sell and what they, and how many people they therefore hire. But how much do they sell? What do they actually sell? Oh, I have an answer for that too. And guess what? Injections are going to be here again. Oops. All right. Demand curve. The demand curve is a combination of ran out of room. Autonomous spending, which we usually think of as investment, right? Investment spending right there. So, and the Oh, and there's a handout for this one too. I typed up a little explanation of this. And of consumption. So demand is going to be a combination of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C is going to come off the slope of the line. I plus G plus X minus M is going to be this intercept right here. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's N sub 0 people working. What will actual spending be? All right. Well, the intercept here, that kind of spending, investment plus government spending plus net exports, they have no direct correlation to actual employment. Actually, M does, but let's ignore that for now. Investment can be high or low with a high rate of employment. We'll go into that big time after the exam. Well, actually, at the end of this first exam and beginning of the second exam. Government spending has no direct correlation to employment. The government isn't limited by how much income people have. Firms aren't limited by how much income people have, all right? And that sounds illogical, but it's not. Foreigners aren't limited by how much income Americans have. And I'm going to explain investment further in just a moment. However, consumption is very much a function of how much employment there is right now, because employment determines income. So at higher levels of employment, you see the consumption goes up and up and up and up and up. All right, so consumption is different at different places on N here. I, G, and X minus M are not different. They're not different as we move along here. They are autonomous spending. They are injections. They are spending that doesn't directly, or spending that isn't directly determined by employment. For example, all right, first of all, let's do X real quick. Obviously, foreigners can still buy stuff from us even if we're all unemployed, right? Because our unemployment is not determining their income, not in a direct sense. Not only can the government spend a lot, even if there is a high level of unemployment, which means we're way back here somewhere. This is employment, of course, but they will. That's precisely what they did after the financial crisis. It's what they did during the summer of the coronavirus crisis. They specifically spent more because unemployment was so high. And in fact, when unemployment is very low, they tend to spend less. So if there's any correlation whatsoever between G and N, it's actually a negative one. But they can do what they want. They are not limited by N. Investment is also not limited by N. As you will learn at the beginning, maybe the middle part of the exam 2 material, banks create credit. And they are not limited by how much savings there is in the macroeconomy, thankfully, all right? But we'll go into the actual operation of banking later. But how firms finance investment is not directly related to current employment. Now, I remember thinking to myself as a student, yeah, but wouldn't firms tend to invest more when when employment was high and invest less when employment was low? There is something to that. There is something to that, yes. There is a greater incentive to want to invest when employment is over here than back here. But there's a very serious limit to that. Because, as you're going to learn at the beginning part of the exam 2 material, in the business cycle, when the economy is going up, the reason it turns is because firms have exhausted, in their opinion, all the investment opportunities. They have cut back on investment, and then that causes the contraction. There's a lot more to it, but that's the basic idea. They cause the contraction. Well, if this is the expansion, when is employment the highest over the course of this expansion? Exactly when they cut back on investment. During this high period of employment, they're investing because everyone has money. But they don't want to invest forever. Investment doesn't make any money for you. Only opening the doors of your restaurant and selling things from your restaurant actually make money from your restaurant. Building the restaurant actually puts you into debt. And so as firms are investing all the way up this expansion right here, they're not investing because they like investing. They're investing because they like opening the doors of what they built and making money afterwards, right? So as soon as they figure they've saturated the market for whatever it is they're selling, they stop, all right? So there's in every recession since World War II, but one, there's been a decline in investment right up here at the end during the expansion, a decline in investment during the expansion which then caused the recession. All right, so long story short, we'll get into that in great detail later. Long story short, none of these variables right here have any direct correlation to n whatsoever. They will bounce around for whatever reasons they bounce around, and we will talk about that later. The only thing we have specifically modeled here is consumption. Consumption goes up as employment goes up because incomes are going up, right? So, let's see. If employment's n sub 0, then total spending, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, is going to be PY sub 0. So, that's what actual sales are going to be for the firm. Let's see, I was going to tell you something else. Oh yeah, sometimes people draw the D curve as kind of curved and flattening out. It doesn't matter. Either way works. I've seen it both ways from people who are proponents of this model. The difference is that you're assuming that there's a change in the percentage of income people tend to spend. But it just doesn't matter. So, let's see. Let's put them both together. All right. So here's Keynes's model of what drives employment. I actually usually do, I started to do it just now. I actually usually do draw my D curve as kind of curved, but it just doesn't, it's not going to make a difference to what we're talking about. That's one of those things where it's a premise that just doesn't change the conclusion. Now, let's see. Let's say that firms decided that they were going to sell they forecast their sales as PY sub 0. So they therefore hired N sub 0 workers. But N sub 0 workers spent, in combination with I and G and X minus M, PY sub 1. Expected, actual. So if firms had orders for more, now how did they sell more than they produced? Either they ran down inventories, or they took back orders. They didn't have the output, but they had more orders than they expected. Anywhere to the left of the intersection, they had more orders than they expected. So what do they do next? Next time period, we hire more workers. We underestimated sales. We lost money we could have made, all right? So they're then going to move up towards the intersection, right? So anywhere to the left of the intersection, firms' actual sales exceed what they expected and they hire more workers. So nothing to the left of the intersection is an equilibrium point. I think you can guess what's going to happen next. I'm going to go ahead and draw it all over again. And Z, D, PY, and this time we'll have firms expecting to sell this much. So they hire that many workers, but in fact that many workers in combination with I plus G plus X minus M. So here we have expected and actual. What they actually sell is PY sub 1. So they accumulate inventory. They have stuff that they didn't end up being able to sell. I'm looking at the glare that's on the, so I'll just try to stay away from that part of the board. I wonder why it got worse over the course of the day. I think we have a skylight right there, and I think that's actually where the light's coming from. Anyway, that's not your problem. Well, actually, it kind of is, isn't it? But it's my problem to fix your problem. All right, so what happens here? Well, they didn't sell as much as they expected, so they lay off workers. So the only equilibrium point is right there. Now, and we do have a point this time. Remember my issue earlier was that in that labor market diagram there wasn't a point that told us where we were. Now we have a point. We have a point. We're at this spot right here. And how did we get there? Because of wages and workers competing with each other? No. It has to do with firms, whether or not their expectation of sales were met. If they were, we're at equilibrium. If their expectation of sales was, the actual sales exceeded that, they hire more. Actual sales fell short of that, they hire fewer. The one thing we haven't discussed, although I did just for a moment, is full employment. Z-D. All right, so here's where we are. We're there. That's the only point where what firms expect to sell is what they actually sell. Where is full employment? Where is the point at which everyone who wants to work has a job? That's demographic. It's not figured out from a graph, in other words. That it's like, well, we have this many people who would like to have a job. It's actually not that hard to work out. We can look it up. We have unemployment figures all the time. And so full employment is either right here, because it could be right there. I mean, we've had very low unemployment before. It could be right here, or it could be to the right. It can't be to the left. Full employment can't be to the left, because we can't have more workers than people who are willing to work. It's called slavery. Instead, it has to be either here or to the right. And something I mentioned earlier, it's actually possible for full employment to be something we simply cannot get to. Because eventually the Z-curve is going to get to the point where, yeah, there's any more workers simply can't be hired at a profit right now. And so this is a problem we're going to address in the third part of the course. What are we going to do if actually full employment isn't even achievable using just a market system? We'll get to that later. Okay, so there you end up with Keynes' explanation. Oops, going to unplug the laptop. Keynes' explanation of what we observe right here. He says what's really going on there, why we see those massive fluctuations in employment, and those are really big. The lowest level, look at the vertical axis, at what those changes are. And of course we don't have coronavirus on here, but then that's not really an economic phenomenon. That was obviously health related and not economics per se. But you can see how big those fluctuations are, and they're highly correlated with expansions and recessions, right? So he's saying, okay, that's what's going on. I should add this. He makes the following simplifying assumption in the general theory. He says, let's assume firms' forecasts are correct, all right? Obviously, firms can forecast incorrectly and cause problems. Sure. There can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Firms can expect to sell less than they really could and thereby cause unemployment. But he says, let's assume away from that, because that's not the big problem. The big problem is even when they're right, we can end up short of full employment. So let's just assume they're right. See you in the next video. Oh, started to erase and I realized I should just stop the video.